Thank you for joining CIE's weekly analysis of the Hamas-Israel war with the best analysts, scholars, rabbis, journalists, economists, and diplomats from around the world. I am Ken Stein, the president of the Center for Israel Education and an Emory University professor emeritus for Middle Eastern history, political science, and Israel studies. Please note that our 21 prior webinars are archived on our website, israeled.org. There are audio and video versions. Please join our Israel learning community. Visit israeled.org. 40,000 viewers do so a week. They come for reliable content and analyses about aspects of Zionism, Israel, its people, culture, and history, all without polemics. The center's work focuses on collecting and providing content, perspective, and sources. We undertake learning and teaching without any bias. And if you generally feel you're benefiting from the weekly webinars and the content of the website, donate to our work. The donate button may be found on the homepage, israeled.org. Since Hamas brutally murdered 1,200 Israelis and others on October 7th, and kidnapped more than 240, Israel still seeks to balance freedom for all hostages with Hamas's military and political defeat or destruction. The war in the south against Hamas and the potential for a major outbreak of conflict with Hezbollah in the north has driven Israelis from their southern and northern border towns, and there are now approximately 150,000 Israelis who are internal refugees, finding temporary housing and lodging in the center of Israel. While Israel's continued its fight against Hamas in the south, there has been in the last 2 weeks a definite increase in Hezbollah rocket and missile attacks on the Israeli north and Israeli replies to Hezbollah, mostly through air attacks. As Israel winds into its 6th month of fighting on both fronts, the Northern Front is a significant threat to Israel's population, economy, and national security. This week, American intelligence officials, in their 2024 threat analysis for the world, noted that Israel would be very likely having to face continued hostile actions from Hezbollah from the north and Hamas in the south, perhaps for years. American aid in the form of Iron Dome and other anti-missile defenses are being used regularly to defend Israeli territory. There are American ships in the Red Sea and in the Mediterranean fending off Iranian proxy attacks. Today's webinar will focus on the dangers that Hezbollah poses to Israel. We're terribly fortunate to have 3 world-class analysts. Eyal Zisser, Vice Rector at Tel Aviv University and a lifelong scholar of modern Syria and the Arab world, has authored more than half a dozen excellent works on Syria and Lebanon. He served as head of the Moshe Dayan Center and Dean of Tel Aviv University faculty. Anat Shapira, Neubauer Research Associate at the Terrorism and Low Intensity Conflict Program at the Institute for National Security Studies, is a doctoral candidate. She's written on low-intensity conflict, Israel's national resilience, Israel's internal evacuations, and much, much more. Yaacov Ayish, Major General retired, served in the Israel Defense Forces for 36 years, retired in 2016. He was an Israeli military attaché at Israel's embassy in Washington and served as Ground Forces Chief of Staff during the Second Lebanon War. I'd like to start by asking Eyal to give us a quick contextual overview of Hezbollah, its objectives, relationship to Iran, Hamas, and maybe Syria. The last time Israel had a prolonged conflict with Hezbollah was in 2006, and that lasted 33 days. By comparison, Israel's war with Hamas has passed the 154-day mark. Hamas and Hezbollah share different, though ideologically tied, objectives, perhaps tied at the Iranian anti-Jewish hip. Hezbollah is embedded in a sovereign state. Hamas is not. Hezbollah has easy land links to resupply. Hamas does not. Hezbollah has a massive arsenal of weapons as compared to the limited ones by Hamas. Eyal, would you kindly frame this discussion about Israel, Hezbollah, in the context of an ongoing war with Hamas in the south?
For the last decade, we were looking to the north, and we did expect in Israel that one day Hezbollah might launch an attack, surprise attack against Israel with all its capabilities. Hezbollah was viewing Israel as the main threat. When we speak about Hamas, we speak about 10 to 15,000 rockets, several thousand activists, warriors, while in the case of Hezbollah, the number is 150 to 180,000 rockets, thousands of capable warriors. So the fear was clearly from Hezbollah, but then we were all caught by surprise. It was Hamas, viewed as the terror organization, incapable, that launched this attack. But Hezbollah is a Lebanese Shiite organization, emerged in Lebanon against a clear background that the Shiites in Lebanon, around 30% of the total population, were deprived of any rights, any place in the Lebanese system. So the plight for a change was evident in the Shiite community, and even without Iran, without Hezbollah, we would have seen the emergence of Shiite forces in Lebanon that are seeking a change and seeking to improve the status of the Shiites in Lebanon. But unfortunately for the Shiites of Lebanon, this historical process was kidnapped by Hezbollah and by Iran. It was Iran that established Hezbollah. It is Iran that supplied Hezbollah with such an impressive arsenal that turned it from another Lebanese militia, and there are many militia, to a strong military force with capabilities that even regular armies, the Syrian army, the Egyptian army, do not possess. Now, Hezbollah was established in the mid-80s. In its platform that was published in 85, it was very clear that the main goal, the first goal, was to liberate Jerusalem. This is to say, to annihilate the state of Israel. But the civil war in Lebanon came to an end, and what we could see were two parallel processes. On the one hand, the continuation of the struggle against Israel as an important goal. On the other hand, the process that people call Lebanonization. The organization integrate into the Lebanese political system, join the government, and people hope that it will turn Hezbollah to be more pragmatic, more moderate. But this didn't happen. As I see it, the struggle against Israel is, in essence, it's part of the organization identity. It's first of all what connected with Iran. Otherwise, Iran wouldn't have given this organization hundreds of millions of dollars every year and such an impressive arsenal. So take the struggle with Israel, you will lose the Iranian support. The other thing is indeed the identity of the organization. It's the belief of its leaders. And without the struggle against Israel, Hezbollah turned to be another unimportant, insignificant Lebanese militia. But what does it mean to fight or to combat Israel? Well, I think that the strategy of Hezbollah was, we are determined to fight Israel. Our goal is to annihilate the state of Israel, to destroy it, but not as Hamas surprise attack, but it's a constant and a long struggle that can take years. And our mission is to inflict casualties, not to lead to a major escalation. War wouldn't serve us. War might bring destruction to Lebanon, a total war. But strike after strike, small strike after small strike, that's what brought the victory in 2000 when Israel withdrew from Lebanon. Attrition, that's what might lead eventually to the collapse of Israel. This, I think, was the main strategy, but at the same time, we cannot ignore the fact that the organization was equipped with an impressive arsenal and built an impressive small army with the declare aim to invade Israel, to occupy the Galilee. So I don't know if what Hamas did with the idea that eventually such a move may lead to a major war that will lead to the destruction of Israel. This is something that was shared by Hezbollah, or Hezbollah thought it's not the time, but clearly it was on the agenda. And the dilemma, what should be the strategy against Israel, ongoing strike, one by one, without bringing a major escalation, is also the dilemma that Hezbollah is facing now. When we look at what happened during the last 155 days, and I was sure for many years that Hezbollah is deterred, is Lebanese, wants to inflict casualties and to show that it fights against Israel, but is, after all, a pragmatic organization that know the balance of power. But I have to admit that after October 7th, I can't be sure anymore.
Anat, if you had to compare the way Hamas has acted over the last 10 or 15 years as compared to the way Hezbollah has acted, are there distinctions that you can make about their methods?
There are some significant differences. For one thing, Eyal has mentioned the Lebanese nature of Hezbollah, and I think one of the things is we need to remember that Hezbollah is a legitimate Lebanese political party, and as such, Hezbollah cares about the citizens of Lebanon. We often say in Israel that Hamas doesn't care about the citizens in Gaza. He doesn't care about the harm and the suffering that are caused to them. I think Hezbollah has more of a concern towards the safety and well-being of Lebanese citizens, and that is in part why there was a perception that it is deterred. I think the other thing is to notice the fact that while, again, Hamas was clearly not committed to the rules of war, not to the distinction between combatants and non-combatants, not to the idea that civilians are not a legitimate target. I don't even want to talk about gender-based crimes. Hezbollah does seem to care about these distinctions. We've seen in the last few months, for example, that Hezbollah focuses a lot of its attacks towards military targets, and it emphasizes the fact that these are military targets. Even when it shoots towards civilian settlements, kibbutzes, it points out that the IDF is using these facilities in order to orchestrate its own operations as a manner of justifying its own actions. We see that Hezbollah does sometimes target civilian targets, but we see that this often happens in response to Israeli attacks that have led to civilian casualties or injuries in Lebanon. So I think all in all, Hezbollah does care about, I wouldn't necessarily say the ethics of war so much as its legitimate status, both in the eyes of the Lebanese population and in the eyes of the international community. And that is why I think it aspires to at least maintain a facade of commitment to what are the generally accepted rules of engagement.
So it's fair to say that Hezbollah is limiting the boundaries of its conflict with Israel by certain rules and regulations which applying itself, and it's seeking to control the intensity of that conflict. Would that be correct?
I think that at the moment that would be correct. I join Eyal in being very shy after October 7th in making predictions and saying things like Hezbollah is deterred. But I do think that what we see now is an organization that is in control of what is happening and has some kind of strategy towards where it would like to go.
In the bigger picture, is it fair to connect the temperate, if I can use the word, actions of Hezbollah with Iran and Iran's broader picture of Iranian needs in the Middle East?
So I think that is part of it. I think another part of it is, again, its care of an escalation in Lebanon. I think ultimately Hezbollah is still working within what we generally tend to call the equations. So, for example, it has extended the range of its attacks. In the last few days, we've seen quite a lot of attacks towards the Golan Heights, which previously, though it was attacked not to the same extent that we've seen in the last few days, and that is a response to Israel expanding the range of its attacks inside Lebanon. So it is escalating the situation, but these escalations are still within the accepted equations that we've come to be familiar with.
Yaacov, from your perspective of the last 40 years, how have you seen Hezbollah evolve into its present state? And what do you think you've learned since October 7th about its actions vis-a-vis Israel that might be similar or different?
I'll be very careful and I'll divide it into two. I think there is a very clear distinction between the period that Hezbollah defined itself as the defender of Lebanon and have proven it until May 2000, almost on a daily basis against the IDF. And in 2000, after the withdrawal, I think Hezbollah had an identity issue. And from there onwards, I think what we have seen was a strategic, I would say, transformation of Hezbollah. And when I'm saying transformation, it wasn't only at the strategic level, but also at the operational level. And the main reason behind it was the nuclear project of Iran. And I think from there onwards, what we have seen was a massive investment of Iran in Hezbollah to the stage that in 2006, they were basically with the same capabilities, even a bit less, that Hamas have today. It wasn't their intent in 2006 to go for a full-scale war, but it happened, and they were surprised. And from there onwards, the supreme leader, together with Hassan Nasrallah, decided to rebuild Hezbollah. Again, a massive investment, applying all the lessons from the 2006 war. And from there onwards, what we see is not only a terror organization, but basically a terror army. When I'm saying an army, you can compare it to many armies or militaries in Europe. I'm not sure that there are too many with the same capabilities. Professor Zisser mentioned few of those capabilities. We tend to speak about rockets and missiles, but we tend to forget the advanced projects such as air defenses that they own today, and precise guided munitions that were developed in Iran and moved into Lebanon via Syria, something that in comparison to many countries in Europe, you would find they don't own those capabilities, definitely not on the same scale. Having said that, mentioning the transformation, I have to explain that what was invested in Hezbollah was invested for a very clear purpose. It was for the D-Day, for the day that Israel will attack Iran. And for that sake, it was part of a grand strategy of Iran, which is not only Hezbollah, it's Hezbollah. It's the Shia militia in Iraq. It's the attempt of Qasem Soleimani to build a Shia militia in Syria of 100,000 militants, and the Houthis in Yemen to complete the circle. And we can see today how effective it could be. When I'm saying effective, take a look at the challenge that Hezbollah posed not only from Lebanon, but from Lebanon, from Syria. You can see the Houthis from Yemen, and think about many other players that can come into that equation. So I think that transformation led to a very serious, I would say, strategic and operational challenge for Israel at the north in two fronts. I'm afraid that it's an imminent threat, and it's only a matter of time that we will have to face it. Bear in mind that we didn't initiate anything in October 7th against Hezbollah. They decided to escalate, and I think, as it was mentioned, they know that they can control it until a certain stage.
You mentioned the Iranian effort to achieve nuclear weapons capability. Where does Hezbollah fit into what Iran would prefer Hezbollah's actions to be? Is it the desire, do you think, of Tehran to have Hezbollah wait in its attacks against Israel so Hezbollah could be a first retaliation against Israel? Should Israel go after the Iranian nuclear capability?
It's a very well-known notion that Iran prefer the Arabs to fight for them, and they have proven it all over. We have seen it in Iraq, We can see it now in Yemen. We can see it in Syria, and we can see it in Lebanon. And I think this is something started with Khomeini, and it was a major lesson taken from the Iran-Iraq war. And from there onwards, they decided they prefer to use proxies. And they have proven it quite effective. And it was something orchestrated by Qasem Soleimani for many years, with full backup from the supreme leader. And in most cases, it was very effective. Take as an example the case of the civil war in Syria. When Qasem Soleimani wanted a reinforcement into Lebanon, and he brought it to the Majlis in Iran, and he took hundreds of Iranian soldiers into Syria, he was criticized heavily for that. With all the backup he was getting from the supreme leader, he was criticized on it heavily, up to the extent that he was forced to take some of them back immediately into Iran. And instead, what we have seen in Syria, together with the Russian support, is Hezbollah. And suddenly, it wasn't Hezbollah who is the defender of Lebanon against Israel. Suddenly, it was Hezbollah, the defender of the Assad regime. So it was only a clear example that Iran can orchestrate and navigate those proxies for its own needs. And the most important need is to deter Israel from attacking Iran by proving the capabilities that Hezbollah have and control all over Lebanon against Israel for that D-Day. And to some extent, you can say today that Israel is deterred.
For clarity purposes, the Syrian civil war is,
I think, 2011 onwards.
And then you said Soleimani was interested in bringing Iranian fighters to Syria, and there was resistance against him for doing so.
Absolutely. The resistance came from the Majlis, which is the Iranian parliament. He didn't have the backup he expected, although he was supported by the supreme leader, which is the last word in Iran. And this is only an example to show how sensitive they are for Iranian lives. And this is another explanation why they are investing so heavily in proxies and how good they are in navigating them and using them.
What is the connection between Iran to Syria and Syria to Hezbollah? How did that evolve, and where is it today?
It's a paradox because Syria used to be a country that spoke about Arab nationalism, a secular country, and still it found itself fighting together with Iran, which is not Arab and not secular, but they had a common enemy. At first it was Saddam Hussein of Iraq, now it's, of course, Israel. Relations go back to the early 80s. And for many years, people speculate that if and when Syria would sign a peace agreement with Israel, one of the conditions would be to sever its relations with Iran. But I think nowadays it's quite clear. And the Syrians said, we are ready to sign a peace agreement with Israel, but we would never cut our relation with Iran. And now it's quite clear that in a moment or two, when Bashar was pushed to the wall, when the war started in Syria, these were the Iranians who gave him support. So he would never give up its relations with Iran. Now, the problem is that in the 80s, in the 90s, when Bashar came to power, Syria was a regional power. And Syria was the one that approved Iranian presence and Iranian support for Hezbollah. Syria was the one that gave support and actually allowed Hezbollah to operate in Lebanon, which was under Syrian hegemony and Syrian control. But since the civil war, Syria is not what it used to be. It's a weak state and much dependent on Iran. And still, Assad owed to the Iranians, depend on the Iranians, but he has also Russia, and Russia has different interests. And I think that his policy is quite clear. But by the way, Hamas supported the rebels in Syria. And Bashar will never forgive Hamas, will never forget what Hamas did to him. So I don't think that he is very sorry about what is happening in Gaza. Its policy was always, we have so many problems, we don't need to engage in a war with Israel. The problem is that it's not in his hands. Iran has some presence in Syria, some influence in Syria. They might not ask him. So what we hear from Syria is mainly about the efforts of Bashar to avoid any escalation, not to be dragged into a war with Israel, using the Russians against the Iranians. But unfortunately, he is not in full control over his own country. Nobody asked him. And that's the main problem. So if there might be a war with Syria, it will not be necessarily with Syria itself, but with Iranian proxies, with Iranian forces, with Shiite militias that Iran deployed in Syria.
Iran is a Mediterranean country because of its influence through Syria and into Lebanon. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, now it's not something new. Also, the Shah was trying to establish presence in Lebanon. This is something Iran always seek to look at Iraq, Syria, Lebanon as some sort of security zone. That's also how the current regime look at it. And unfortunately for us, we are not to be an ally of Iran as it was under the Shah, but a major enemy. Also, it's not only the Mediterranean, it's also the Red Sea, it's also the Indian Ocean. I think it's important to say that what I think keep the relations between Israel and the Arab world, most Arab states, some of them condemn Israel, of course, express sympathy with Gaza, but none of them cut its relations with Israel. It's quite clear to them the degree of the danger from Iran. Iran was able to establish itself in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, also some influence on the Palestinians in Gaza. It uses it now against Israel, to some extent also against the United States, but in the past and in the future, it will use it also against Arab countries. It's quite clear to everyone here in this region.
And not back to the rules of engagement, if there is such a thing. Are there any conditions under which Hezbollah might withdraw north of the Litani River, where they might agree to stay in the Lebanese political system, but wind down their conflict with Israel?
As I said before, I think everyone is kind of shy of making predictions these days. What I can say is, first of all, that if Hezbollah decides that, it will have nothing to do with morality and rules of engagement, and it will be out of its own interests. I think part of the problem that we need to take into account, and you can see that, for example, when you look at the lists of casualties that Hezbollah is publishing, because obviously Hezbollah acknowledges their casualties. When you see where they come from, you understand that many of the Hezbollah fighters that have died in the current conflict are inhabitants of southern Lebanon. This complicates heavily the idea of Hezbollah withdrawing north of the Litani River, because you're essentially asking people to move out of their homes. It is at this point, I think, in the war, a fairly accepted notion that many of Hezbollah's fighters are inhabitants of southern Lebanon, and at least some of the Radwan force, which is actually the main focus of interest when we talk about the withdrawal of Hezbollah, are also inhabitants of southern Lebanon. And I think in part this means that even if Hezbollah claims to have withdrawn, we have no actual way of enforcing that. In the INSS, we hold, at the beginning of the war, it was a weekly survey, and now it has become a monthly survey, where we ask citizens of Israel about various issues concerning the war. And one of the things that we've asked would be, what would be required for the Israeli settlers that have been evacuated to move back into their homes? And what you see is that about 20% of the respondents maintain that people will not return to their homes unless there is a war. But there is a large majority, as can be seen, all other 80%, that doesn't necessarily want a war. And here the answers of the respondents are divided between people requiring an international agreement backed by international guarantees for the withdrawal of Hezbollah and some sort of an agreement for a ceasefire, heavy fortification and extending the defenses of Israeli settlements, and a combination of the two. So I think ultimately what we will have is some sort of a compromise where Hezbollah may say it withdrew north of the Litani, and it will be less visible, shall we say, in terms of lookout outposts and things like that, but not necessarily in terms of the actual fighters. We will have some sort of an international regime or guarantees regarding any action from southern Lebanon towards northern Israel, and we will have much heavier fortification. I think what we need to remember is that while in the past, and to a large extent also today, Hezbollah's missiles arsenal, everything that Eyal has described in the beginning of the conversation, was a major concern. After the trauma of October 7th, I think people are more traumatized by the idea of a land invasion. There's sort of a feeling that we can handle the missiles, even though I think the threat is in a completely different magnitude than what most people perceive. But the idea of the land invasion is what scares people. It is within that perception that even less visibility of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon will be meaningful for Israeli citizens.
That's a very good distinction. Thank you. Yaacov, is Israel prepared to come across certain kinds of armaments and protections that exist already for Hezbollah in southern Lebanon that would deter an Israeli ground invasion? Will Israel be surprised like it was in Gaza?
After what we have seen in October 7th, we have to be very careful and assume that we don't know everything. And if the question is dealing with the fact that we are ready or preparing to this kind of war, definitely we are. It's going to be devastating. It's not going to be a walk in the park. If someone is considering it something like that, no, it's going to be very tough, very challenging. They have their own infrastructure. They have their own capabilities. One of the lessons that they have applied right after the 2006 war was, instead of having those capabilities in depots, mainly in southern Lebanon, they decided to deploy them all over Lebanon. So for us to deal with the Hezbollah challenge will be to fight all over the state of Lebanon, to include the Bekaa Valley and the area of Beirut and southern Lebanon. Having said that, I would like to refer to something that Anat have mentioned regarding 1701, the UN resolution made right after the 2006 Second Lebanon War, saying that basically south to the Litani, Hezbollah or any other military forces are not allowed, to exclude the Lebanese armed forces and the UN forces. And for that sake, by the way, they have deployed a massive amount of UN forces at the beginning. But from there onwards, we saw the French battalion leaving, the German presence in the Mediterranean leaving, and so on and so forth. And we saw what Hezbollah is doing to those who were left behind for that UN mission. Basically, they have ignored them, not to mention that they treated them with very tough measures, up to the extent that they were fully deployed all over the border. And they allowed themselves to continue digging the tunnels that we have exposed in 2020. And just before October 7th, they were fully deployed all over Lebanon, to include southern Lebanon with the Radwan forces. If we would go back a step backwards to May 2000, we will find that Radwan unit, which is a commando unit, special forces unit, the equivalent to the Nukhba unit, but bigger and stronger and well-trained and well-experienced, because they fought in Syria, they were deployed north to Litani, a place called Kala Jabur. In October 7th, they were deployed on the Israeli border. So in terms of readiness and the capability to surprise the IDF, the kibbutzim and the villages and farmers who were cultivating the land over there, they had all the capabilities in place. Now assume that they will be forced north to the Litani River, as the UN resolution said. What will happen a week after, once they will redeploy them on the Israeli border? That's the big question. What will happen with all the other capabilities? That's the big question. And in terms of deterrence, what we have seen on October 7th in the south is a failure of deterrence. So we have, as in Israelis, to ask ourselves tough questions, not only about the ability to give a relevant alert to the Israeli people and to the IDF, but also what have happened to one of the pillars of Israel's strategy, which is deterrence. And these are tough questions, not yet asked, not yet discussed in Israel, but we will have to address them. And they are highly relevant when we are talking about Hezbollah, highly relevant.
What would motivate Hezbollah to preemptively strike or go directly at Israel in a major conflict in the next week to 5 months?
I don't know. After October 7th, I'm thinking about Hamas of October 6th and the way we analyzed it and the relevancy of Hamas in October 6th. It wasn't a player for the last 2 years. And suddenly we faced such a strategic and operational surprise. So I'll be very humble and I'll say that about Hezbollah, first, we don't know. And I think it have to start with the supreme leader in Iran, and it will have to be an Iranian interest, unless Nasrallah will decide that he's taking his own destiny in his own hand and he's going to do something which he didn't in October 7th. He didn't join. What he is showing right now to Hamas and to the rest of the Arab world is solidarity, not more than that. And he's suffering massive casualties for that. More than 300 Hezbollah militants were killed in the last 159 days. It's massive losses that he is facing, and he has to explain it to his own people. And I'm leaving aside the material and the other losses. What will be the reason? I think it should start in Iran. And so far, with all the cautious, I would say that I don't identify one at the moment.
Anat, Eyal, would either one of you say that Nasrallah is risk averse?
I wouldn't necessarily say he's risk averse. I think he takes calculated risks. I think the biggest risk in terms of us boiling down into a full-scale war with Hezbollah would be a miscalculation. I don't necessarily think there will be a moment of a decision, but I think what we're seeing is a gradual escalation. The war now is very different to what it was a month ago, to what it was 3 months ago. So I think we can see a very gradual process of escalation. And I think at any moment, something could happen, like a mass civilian casualty event on either side of the border, which will necessitate a response, again, on either side of the border, and lead us all to an escalation, which perhaps nobody wants, but will be seen as necessary. We need to always remember that it won't necessarily be a decision so much as being dragged into it by an uncontrolled chain of events.
Let me remind us all that after the 2006 war, Nasrallah said, if I would have known, I wouldn't have started it in the early beginning. But at the same time, there are those who say, I'm not ready to take any risk because I might do something that eventually lead to a war. I don't want to take any risk. Nasrallah is not this guy. He takes risks, assuming, hoping that eventually he might be in control, and also based on what he sees as his expertise in reading Israel. He is sure that he knows Israel better than the Israelis know themselves, and he started the war. He started the war. Now, it's not a major war. It's not launching rockets to but he started the war. Some reports in Israel raised the possibility that the Israeli government discussed responding by launching a major attack in Lebanon. So he took the risk, hoping that he can keep the level of fire low, hoping that he understands Israel, and still he took the risk.
This has been terribly illuminating and enriching, and I want to thank the three of you for your time. It's been really incisive. The analysis has been great. Let me remind our listeners that both Hezbollah and Hamas subscribe to essentially the same notion that they want to degrade, demoralize, and ultimately destroy the state of Israel. They're unified certainly by that ideology. And if you believe that knowing Israel's story and knowing the story of Zionism and the right of Jews to have a place of their own and self-determination, maybe you'll support the work that we do to try and educate others on that notion.